Let's go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zephyr's Adjusted for Risk podcast from the shores of Lake Tahoe. As we all know, we are embarking on the greatest wealth transfer in history. We also know that investing is very emotional or behavioral. Well, today I have on the perfect guest to talk about how financial advisors can help close the generational gap while also discussing about the impact emotions have on investing. But first, today's episode is sponsored by the award-winning Zephyr, which helps investment professionals make more informed investment decisions on behalf of their clients. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Jim Langabeer. Jim is a behavioral financial advisor, author of The Quest for Wealth: 6 Steps for Making Mindful Money Choices, and managing principal at Yellowstone Wealth Advisors. Jim, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's such an honor to have you on. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and Yellowstone Wealth Advisors?
Yes, yeah, and thank you again for having me on. I really
Mhm.
appreciate it. So, just a little bit about me. I started off in business and financial roles. I did asset management for. I was one of the international asset managers for one of the five largest chemical and oil and gas companies in the world. And I got a lot of training there on how to manage lots of money, how to handle leases and cash flow and purchases of capital equipment. And I took that to my next job where I became chief operating officer at a software firm. And the software firm was basically trying to help big companies, Coca-Cola and Barnes and Noble and big names, Dunkin' Donuts, how to figure out how to optimize things that they want to do. So optimize inventory or optimize a promotion or a marketing, or when's the best time to pull off a redeemable coupon ops things. And so I had a lot of understanding of the way marketing and business worked. And I have a PhD in decision sciences, which is really the marrying of cognitive science, like the way the brain works, but also with math and business. So I was really tailored towards how to apply psychological principles to business for a variety of reasons. And I've been a professor of behavioral science for a number of years at the University of Texas. And I had probably over the last decade been asked so many times to come in and do individual coaching for people. Can you help me figure out what retirement plans I need to get into, or what options do you recommend here? And I always did this on the side, and then I used COVID to get retooled, get my registered investment advisor firm set up, and so I've just started this about 4 years ago, and I really work for people that I like, people that are professionals, and I try to focus on entrepreneurs as much as possible. People that are struggling to do both jobs, that basically, try to run a family and keep family life, but kick something off. And I know how that is. I've started three companies that I've led and had successful exits from. And so I try to. That's what Yellowstone really does: is try to use behavioral finance principles for people that really need it in the entrepreneurial or business executive roles.
Fantastic, Jim. That's great. A couple of things. Exciting time to be in Austin for Texas and how well the Longhorns are playing in football. Very exciting times there. And number two, I love that you mentioned you like working with people that you like, entrepreneurs, business oriented, because, in all my conversations I have with, people in this space, one of their biggest talking points to financial advisors is work with the niche of clients that you enjoy working with. It makes your life better.
Yes,
But it also, makes it easier for you to help them also, right? So very good point there
exactly.
that, you're
Yes.
focusing on a niche group of people that you work well with.
Yeah, and I sort of understand. Obviously, not all sectors do I understand, but the entrepreneurial
Yeah,
mindset and the behavioral mindset, I do understand that.
perfect. I mentioned at the beginning, you're an author of a book titled The Quest for Wealth: 6 Steps for Making Mindful Money Choices. Why did you decide to write the book? What was your process there?
So there's a lot of traditional books on investing, and a lot of them are very technical. There's a couple of good wealth management books, and they're this thick. And there's a couple books on psychology of finance or the psychology of money, which are good theoretical books, but don't get into any of the practical aspects. And the CFP board, as an example, is really pushing, emphasizing behavioral finance. But I really don't find that there's a lot of good resources out there. I think they're just too academic, too thick. And what I wanted this book to do was to really appeal to people that want to know what the concept is, but more importantly, how do I do something with it? And so I built 6 steps for people to follow, which just kind of walks normal people through, like, step by step. How do I move forward in thinking about wealth building when I know I'm dealing with emotions and fears and optimism and all these different, things that we've got going inside of us? And so I really wanted it to be a much more pragmatic book, simpler to read, shorter, and could really be digested by people.
Right. It's my type of book. Shorter,
Mhm.
easier to read. Like you said, so many books now, especially in this space, they're so technical, right? Where it's great, but it's nice to get a book that it's more enjoyable, a little bit
Yes.
lighter. So fantastic. It's a fantastic book. And we'll talk more about that later and where our listeners can get it or find the book.
Great.
You often talk about wealth is not a number. We did a webcast earlier this year together. And in the book, you often talk about wealth is not a number. And I think that's I love that concept. What do you mean by that?
So there's a couple things. So one is, I see the advertisements on TV for firms all the time, and they're pitching. Well, this person's number is 1.3 million, and this person's number is 2.8, and it's this ideal, elusive number that we as financial advisors might calculate in a tool to say, based on your goals and based on your cash flow needs and estimates of all these things, this is possibly what you might need going into retirement years. But as someone that deals with computational science and behavioral science, I know that those numbers are totally inaccurate because we don't know all of the key variables. We don't know, are we going to die at 71, or are we going to die at 99 or 115? We just don't know. That's key. We don't really know how much we're going to spend 5 years into retirement. We make these estimates of, like, oh, you're going to need 80%, 75% of what you did going into your retirement. You're going to need a little bit less. Those numbers are totally exaggerated. In some cases, they're down to 10 or 20%. In other cases, people spend more, but we really don't have a good way of knowing. So, wealth is not a number to me means, really, one is we can't predict it with any certainty. So, we're just going to do our best, but don't get fixated on that number. But the other thing is that if you ask someone, and I see these big investment firms go out and survey people, what number would make you wealthy? At what point do you think? And I think the number that came back from the large investment firm this year was like $1.5 million saved would mean I'm wealthy. And that number, again, is completely irrational because, first of all, we have a survey that's going out to a group of people that are probably already their customers, and people that are customers of investment advisor firms are, by and large, the top 20% of people making the most money. So the number is really, really inflated from reality. But also, it's just completely relative. What I need is going to be completely different than what my father needed. For instance, he died as a CPA who would never spend a dime. So he went into retirement. He probably could afford 30, 40,000 a month in what he saved, and he spent maybe $1,000 a month. So if you ask him what rich man, it would mean nothing compared to another person. So I don't like it when people get wrapped around a single number, like, I need 1 million, I need 2 million, because the goalpost changes. And as soon as you hit 1 million, you realize that's not enough. That's also not enough. What was I thinking? I need 2 million. And I can tell you, I've passed the number of thresholds myself where I thought, no, if I just hit this number or that number, And it really is never enough because we're dealing with a brain that no matter how much we want to think of an abundance mindset, we are scarcity people. We don't know how long we're going to live or how much we need or what might come up or what if I get cancer and I need to go to a hospital. So we just save and save and save and save. And so I just tell people, think about your goals, think about your desired endpoint, how much cash you think you want. We'll do the best to come up with some projections, but don't get fixated on an individual number.
Jim, that's such great, fantastic advice there, because you're right. When we focus on, and everyone should have goals, financial goals, investment goals, focus on those because, like you said, there's so much uncertainty out there. And unfortunately, that uncertainty for our lifestyle is a lot around health, right? We don't know
Yes.
how our health is going to be. I have a 7-year-old son. Hopefully, maybe he'll get a scholarship playing baseball or something, but there's probably a chance he's not. So there's
Right.
so much uncertainty there. And to me, when I think of wealth, I don't think of it sometimes, obviously money comes into play with it, but to me, it's other things. I feel wealth in that fact that I can live in Tahoe and go skiing and snowboarding and mountain biking.
Beautiful.
That to me is provides more wealth to me than dollars, right? So there's everything, like you
Exactly.
said, is centered around that one number, 1.5 million or so. I kind of take it with a grain of salt, like with what you were saying.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's much more about wealth should be much more about quality of life and what allows us to afford this quality of life in the cities that we want to be in. And it may not be 20 million or 10 million or 1 million even. It's each person is so personal and relative. So it's a good point.
I love that. Yep. That quality of life, and whatever dollar amount you want to put on that, go ahead. But I love it. And I love that concept of, wealth is not a number. I think it's fantastic. So speaking of wealth, we're, like I said, we're in the midst of the greatest wealth transfer in history. Some people say we're not there yet. Some people said that it started, years ago. And I've seen figures around that $30 trillion mark and all that. What are some ways financial advisors can bridge that generational gap between during a generational wealth transfer? There's so much talk about the baby boomers and then Gen X and the differences. How can we bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think that's going to be key. I saw a number, I think it was yesterday or over the weekend. I think it was Wall Street Journal put out 100 trillion. So that's the highest I've seen. 80 trillion is the number that Federal Reserve has put out in their most recent brief on this. But no matter what the number, 30 to 100 trillion, these numbers are so big we can't even imagine what that means. But from an advisor perspective, I like to think of it as we're just we're made up of relationships, and so a relationship with our client means that that client has trust in us, and it may be fiduciary, maybe hopefully is, but isn't always. But it's built on relationship and trust, and especially with the generations of the baby boomers and the silent generations, that is the one of the most important quality and characteristics. And when that generation passes away and assets are transferred on to the next generation or the two generations down to grandkids or wherever it's going, extended children, there will be zero relationship with the new advisor or with the new RIA. So where the assets are the new custodians, there is no trust. There's no nothing, because in many cases it's passing from one generation, let's say, to a grandchild who they never discussed money. And most of the time this is the case. Money does not come up with a number of people from prior generations until the very end. And so how do you, as an investment advisor or financial advisor, how do you rebuild a relationship with people that you don't know, who have
Mm,
now inherited money that they may or may not be comfortable with? And in most cases I find that people that are getting funds have not had exposure to this kind of funds before.
yeah.
So this is totally overwhelming to them. It brings on a whole host of emotions. And from a behavioral finance perspective, my main focus What that does is when we become very uncomfortable with subjects, we tend to procrastinate about subjects. And so we might push off decisions that might need to be made. And so maybe in the short term, we say, well, let's just keep money where it's at. So maybe that would look initially good for an advisor. Let's just keep things as they are. But at some point, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road, there will be a time when this relationship is going to need to be shored up. Otherwise, assets walk, and assets will walk. There's going to be a number of these, let's say 100 trillion. There's going to be half of that, I would imagine, that's going to go from one place to another place. Let's say I'm used to using bank X. Dad was using bank Y. When I get the money, it's going in bank X. It's going where I'm comfortable with it. And if that means it's a different city and a different advisor and you're not part of it, okay. So this should be a stressful time for many people who have built their entire wealth portfolio as an
Mhm.
advisor on people from different generations. So what the best thing for me is to really focus on relationships and understanding that next generation, how they want to communicate with you. It's not all stereotypical, but how do you want me to talk to you? What are the goals? What are the things that are most important to you in this? And also, there needs to be a lot of education right up front. The financial literacy is what's going to be a gap because people who didn't build that money probably don't understand that money, and they don't understand for sure some of the investments. And the more complicated we make things as advisors, the more complicated the strategies, the more likely the future will be pulling out assets. So I think there's just a whole opportunity to rebuild relationships, rebuild communications, try to understand what this new client wants, and to make changes accordingly. Don't No matter what you did for grandfather for 45 years, it doesn't mean that same strategy is going to work with the next person. So be prepared to adapt your strategy.
Jim, that's fantastic. I think we could obviously talk for hours just about that. You touched on some fantastic points there. Number one, misconceptions about communication with these younger generations. So you're telling me that not all of them just want to talk via text or social media?
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, so a lot of them might, and it might even be on tools you don't know. They're
Okay.
not approved by your firm through compliance. So yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of retooling and re-education, and it's just kind of like the railroads. Railroads had to figure out how to adapt. I think that we're in that pivotal spot where we've never in history seen this kind of money flowing. When you look at the wealth accumulation over the last 100 years, it's really only been in the last 20 years that we've accumulated about 80% of all this wealth. All the prior generations had very little wealth transfers, and now we're talking about this massive move. And I think we're underestimating it if we just think it's going to be business as usual for us as an advisor.
Yeah, that's interesting. And talking about wealth, a lot of times we talk about moving through generations, but we're also, and I've talked a lot about this, women are going to hold the largest portion of investable assets coming up. That transition is going to start moving to women. How does that impact it? Speaking of education and building relationships, a lot of times over the years, it's always financial advisor with the husband or the male
Right.
person of the family. How does that impact them? What should financial advisors think about that?
Yeah, I think get prepared for that as well. Just understanding gender gaps is really gender differences is really going to be important. And a lot of my clients as well, I'm seeing are separating their money, and so I'm seeing a lot more where, well, I deal mainly with executives, but where executives keep their money separated, and so women are their own financial decision maker, and a man might be for his own personal wealth, but sometimes they're not even commingling. So in the case of inherited assets where it goes down to women, I think that's something that advisors definitely need to get down to the level of: what are your beliefs, what are your attitudes about certain things, what are your feelings about certain kinds of stocks, like we used to do. Do you want smoking stocks or alcohol? It goes well beyond that, because there's a lot of the environmental and sustainability type factors which are we see when we see surveys have significant gender differences where a female might feel completely different than a man on the same topics. And so I recognizing that is not going to come up in a normal conversation. So how do you as an advisor get down to that level? How do you use assessments and tools and the right questioning to say what matters to you most? And let's get down to that. I think man or woman, that's the key. How do we get to that fundamental beliefs, attitudes, and dispositions, the traits for each person that we're going to be dealing with in the future.
You mentioned earlier about retooling, right? You could think of that retooling in terms of technology. How do we communicate with the younger
Yeah,
clients? Retooling in terms of, you know, re-looking at the investments that whether it's the younger generations or maybe the woman who's going to take over the money, and we're going to talk about emotions here shortly, they're more attached to their investments and maybe a male is. A male's looking for
yeah,
returns, right? Females going to look at more investing with their emotions in what they believe in, and I think that's the case with younger generations too. So let's
yeah.
talk about emotions. Investing, as we know, is very emotional, very
Mhm.
behavioral. What is the dominant emotion in investing, and how can a financial advisor help deal with those client emotions?
The biggest emotion we see that impacts investing and saving is fear. And fear comes in many forms. So, one form of fear is the state of paralysis where you're just stuck and you don't know what to do and you're so afraid. And that would be somebody comes into your house and they're armed and you're laying in bed and you absolutely have no, your brain is spinning, having absolutely no traction on what the right thing is to do at
Mhm.
that moment. That's real fear. But then there's this level that goes all the way down to tension and anxiety, and this, we've had this long continuum of things which are in the fear emotion overall. And so worry and excessive worry and anxiety leading up to fear, all of those things can most of the time negatively impact the way we make financial choices of any sort. If I think my options are limited, then I'm going to do something completely different than if I thought I had 15 different things to do. And what fear does is it brings us down to the basic biological level within the brain, which says I really only have a couple choices, fight or flight or just freeze. And that unfortunately is the same with investing. I either leave it here or I do something, and it's something drastic, and there's no in between. So fear brings out the worst side of decision making in general because it just takes choice and wipes it out, and it makes our brain thinks in terms of dichotomies and binary, and so what we want to do as advisors is we want to take the fear out of consumers' head. So we can't do that with all sorts of uncertainty. We don't know the answers to a number of things, but what we can do is say, I think that you might be overestimating that specific concern that you're talking about. Well, let's go into detail more about, tell me about what's happening here. Why are you worried about this? And, a lot of it might get to, well, this happened to my dad, or it might happen to one person I knew, or, something like that. And it's usually anecdotal things.
Mhm.
It's not things which are common. And the role of an advisor might be to just play chief comforter and say, things are going to be fine. The strategies I'm working on with you, we'll be able to address that. Because when you're full of fear, you're full of buying or selling. That's it. And it's just things that go through your head without a lot of cognition, a lot of rationality, a lot of conscious thought. And with all financial decision making, the more we can bring conscious thought into it, the better our choices are going to be.
I'm glad you brought up rational. A lot of times people think I'm irrational, and it's probably right. But as a financial advisor, I kind of think that's one of the primary roles is helping your clients make rational decisions in moments of fear or crisis or chaos. So I'm really glad you brought that up. How does, during COVID, YOLO and FOMO really took off
Yeah.
in terms of investing? how should financial advisors who are used to working with older clients have no idea FOMO or YOLO means? How can they deal with that and help financial or help their clients get through those emotions?
Yeah, I mean, I think advisors themselves have to make sure they're keeping up on continuing education, going to seminars, learning new skills. And I really do recommend the art of interviewing and the art of having thoughtful discussions as something that advisors really need to do. And if you look at the structure of a lot of advisors, firms, there's a chief advisor, there's many associates, and then there's other people. And the relationship part is really left to most of the other people. And the annual meeting might be with an advisor where he gets together and he looks at some of the things and he or she summarizes what they think was most important over that year. I think all of that's going away. I don't think things are becoming, I think the annual occurrence of things is going to become much more frequent. I think with artificial intelligence, we're going to have a lot of people out there second guessing what we're doing. And so the more we can try to be a buffer between what is floating through our clients' heads at that moment and what we think might happen, like bring reality to a situation. I think that's really the role going forward for advisors. Just, I think you do have to retool, you have to retrain, go to some more seminars. They're not always at places like FPA or,
Mhm.
an advisor conference. You might have to go elsewhere, but really trying to understand, because you're right. During COVID, I think most people were not clear if we were ever coming out of COVID or if this is the new norm. And if it is the new norm, what does it mean in terms of wealth building? I mean, for them, if you thought you were permanently living in the state of a pandemic or a virus and you couldn't leave your house, well, there wasn't a whole lot of sense in saving millions of dollars for vacations, which I'll never take.
Mhm.
So the fear of missing out and spending and all now, that would be pretty dominant during those times as
Mhm.
well. So we saw streaming apps, they went through the roofs if you look through the numbers.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that now we've settled back in. I'm hoping we don't go into any other future pandemics, but it's pretty probable we will during our lifetime have something else,
Yeah.
now that we've seen one. But it's for the advisor, it's still the same. It's like, how do we bring common sense, how we bring rationality into what we know is an unclear or unfocused financial process for most people who think about their numbers only periodically, while we think about
Mhm.
numbers 100% of the day.
Yeah. You know what, Jim? That's fantastic. And it goes back to the younger generation. A couple of things. Education. I think throughout this whole conversation, the underlying theme here is education, whether a financial advisor going to seminars or conferences to gain more knowledge on how they handle these situations or the generational gap. Also,
Yeah,
educating your clients, especially the younger clients who are in the digital era where everything is at the finger or at the tip of their fingertips, right? They can get data information anytime they want, which is completely different. That's what you're saying, like that communication, instead of being an annual thing, is going to probably have to be more often, because these clients now can just get all this information whenever they want it. So it's got to be much more fluid in building that trust and education so they don't walk.
exactly. Yeah. And what I find is with whether it's Chat GPT or Gemini or any of these things, or when we look in finance specific robo investors, we can get point answers to questions. So I say, what is, and then I'll get an answer spit out. But what I may not still understand is the big picture. So financial advisors play a big role in saying, I want to make sure, I want to step back and I want to just talk about all the range of options that
Mhm.
could be available to you and just make sure you understand the difference. And it may be very basic to you, like what's the difference between an index fund and a mutual fund versus a equity?
Yeah.
It's not to clients. I find that the old financial advisors are still talking about bonds. New financial advisors don't know what a bond is because nobody buys them anymore. But they still play some role, right? So just basics of, let's talk about what a CD is, possibly that might at some point come into your strategy. Let's talk about what money markets are. Just basics. I think the financial educating clients and making sure we're on even playing field, I think is really important. And if you get a client who doesn't speak, it more than likely means they're in over their head and you already have talked over them and they don't understand where you're at in this conversation. That's never a good sign.
Yeah.
So I always like to say, did all of that make sense? Do I need to back up? Do you want to talk about something more in detail, or did I answer the wrong question? Was I off? Just to make sure there's clarity of communication, because the stock market and purchases of funds, that can be extremely overwhelming to an average person who doesn't do this on a daily basis, and I think we take that for granted. But as you lose your relationship with someone from 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and now you go to a new client, just got to go backwards, step back and say, does this client know what the previous client knew? Or do we need to start at ground zero? And that's part of our role.
Jim, that's fantastic. I think that's a great way to wrap up this entire conversation with that talking point. We could go on and on about this subject. There's so much to talk about. That's why you wrote a book on it. And speaking of that book, where can our audience get more information, number one, about Yellowstone Wealth Advisors, and locate your book, The Quest for Wealth: 6 Steps
Okay.
for Making Mindful Money Choices?
Yes. Okay. So online, I'm at Y Wealth, Y the letter, Y Wealth Advisors.com, plural. We're registered in both Texas and New Mexico, have clients in both states. We're not nationwide, although I do financial coaching for people nationwide. And the book is, if you go on Amazon or Barnes and Noble and just type in Wealth Book Langabeer, put my last name, you will get the very first hit will be The Quest for Wealth. There's so many wealth management books out there, you just can't type wealth anymore, because literally there's 700 books that are on Amazon. But if you type Wealth Book Langabeer, number one on Amazon, you'll see it right there.
Fantastic. I will, in the show notes, include links to Yellowstone Wealth Advisors, as well as where you can find your book at too. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it to our listeners. Jim, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was such a fun conversation. Like I said, we could go on for hours. It really was an honor to have you on. And
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much. I enjoyed it.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of Zephyr's Adjusted for Risk podcast. You can watch all of our other episodes on the Zephyr YouTube channel. And lastly, please follow us on the Zephyr LinkedIn page to learn more about Zephyr, and like and subscribe to our Zephyr YouTube channel. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your week.